Hey, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm very thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Amy Gallo, who's an author, best-selling author, speaker, consultant. Amy, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
So, Amy, how would you describe your kind of area of interest and area of research? How would you best describe that?
Yeah, I think that the simplest way to describe it is the things that keep us up at night when it comes to work in terms of our interpersonal interactions. So it's the awkward conversation, the difficult conversation, the conflict, the misunderstanding, anything that gets in the way of us as humans of interacting and collaborating in a productive way.
Well, that's really interesting because I do know that those are the things that occupy a lot of mind space. I mean, you'll have a meeting and people forget what the topics are, but they'll remember, oh my gosh, I misspoke something, or oh, did I insult somebody, or oh my God, I can't believe the person said that. And all the time is focused on that interaction as opposed to, the substantive topic.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I worked as a management consultant for a firm in New York that worked at the intersection of strategy and organization. And this is where my interest in this topic really began, because I'd be in these meetings, these strategy meetings, these big, day-long discussions about how companies wanted to push their culture change initiatives forward. And what I would notice is that you could have the best strategy. You could have the most talented people in the room. You could even have a great facilitator, but whether you were able to succeed or not depended on the way people communicated in that meeting. And if someone was passive aggressive, if someone was dismissive, right, it could completely torpedo the conversation and therefore the strategy. And so I started to care less about the content of what was being said and more about the way in which it was said and the emotional response people had to those interactions.
Well, that sounds like an incredible problem to tackle, and everyone can relate to that. How did you begin to even untackle or unravel, peel the onion back on this problem?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that like many careers, and I'm sure many of your guests have similar experience, it was just a little bit at a time, right? It wasn't that I set out to explore this and I developed this like 10-year plan. It was more that I, had that experience as a consultant. I started talking actually with the partners at the consulting firm about this idea of the informal organization, the interactions behind the scenes that actually made the work get done. We wrote a piece that was or a paper that caught the eye of some editors at HBR, who I then began discussing, doing some writing for them. I started writing for them about 10 years ago, would do articles on these specific topics, but other topics as well. That led to a book about called the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, which was my first book that came out in 2017. And then that later led now to my most recent book called Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People. And all along, I don't do primary research. I'm not an academic, but I talk to academics and researchers who are studying this and really try to translate those findings into practical advice. That's ultimately what I try to do in all my writing, whether it's books or articles, even my own podcast. I really try to focus on taking the academic research that's out there and making it accessible to people who want to make change in their life or in their organization or on their team today.
So tell me some of the highlights of, the problem, and then how, what are some of the things you can do practically to help solve this problem?
Yeah. So, I think there's a chapter in my new book that outlines 9 principles for getting along with anyone. So they might be, you might be dealing with someone who exhibits a certain pattern of behavior, let's say, pessimism or passive aggression or know-it-all arrogance, right? But at the basics, really, you have to think about the way you react and interact with them. So there are specific tactics to handle pessimism, for example, but ultimately you have to lay the groundwork by remembering a few key principles. And I won't go into all 9, but I'll share a couple just to give you a sense. One of them, for example, is to remember that your perspective is just one perspective. There's this concept in social psychology called naive realism, which is the belief that when we see something, a situation, an interaction, a strategy, a project plan, we see it very clearly. We think we see the truth about it. And when someone else disagrees or doesn't see it the same way, we assume that they're misinformed or just plain wrong. And obviously that can't be true, right? It's not that you just see everything clearly, because that person also thinks they see it clearly. So the key in any interaction, any tricky interaction, a negative dynamic you might have with a coworker is remember there's more than one perspective, and you're not seeing things crystal clear. You have to think about how they're seeing it, how others outside are seeing it. And I think opening your mind to the idea that you might be misinformed or you might be wrong about how you're interpreting it can help at least loosen the dynamic a little bit. So that, let's assume that you are, struggling with someone who is a pessimist, right? You might just come to the conclusion that they're negative and I'm positive, right? They're pessimistic and I'm optimistic. They see all the risks, I see all the opportunities, right? That becomes the truth in your eyes, but it's rarely the simple truth, right? And so using that concept, trying to get out of that naive realism is like, okay, well, maybe they're pessimistic in these situations, or maybe my insistence on being optimistic polarizes them into that position. So they feel like they have to come back over and over with that response, right? So it's really about trying to understand the other person as much as you can, but then also trying to use tactics. And one of the things I try to do in all my work is offer different tactics that might work. The tricky thing about negative interactions with your colleagues is don't trust anyone, right, who says, here's a 5-step process to turn your passive-aggressive peer into a collaborative colleague, right? Humans are messy. Our interactions are messy. There's not going to be a clean step-by-step process. Instead, and this is one of the other principles I really advocate for, is that you have to experiment. So you might have a menu of tactics that you get either from my book or from other, people who give advice or other articles, and you have to just adopt a scientist mindset and think about, okay, this is the problem I want to solve. It's the negative dynamic between us. It's the constant back and forth about an idea, and we can't settle on an agreement going forward. That's the problem. I'm going to try one tactic. Let's see how it goes. I'll learn from that. Then I'll refresh my approach, try another, right? You just want to continually refresh your approach and treat it like an experiment, right? What can you learn? And treating it like an experiment also puts you in that curious mindset, which is essential for difficult conversations and handling difficult personalities at work, because the more certain you are, right, the more locked in that dynamic will be, the more cemented it will be. So being curious about your own reaction, about why they're behaving the way they are, about how things could possibly be different, right? That curiosity is going to fuel transformation in that dynamic in yourself in terms of how you see it, and ideally will nudge that other person into more productive behavior.
I like the way you talked about just the idea of kind of loosening that concretization, because one of the other dangers about having this idea, like the way you see it as the only right way, is that once you get locked into that viewpoint, which I agree is completely what people do, is then that leads you to the next conclusion about that and the next conclusion, and pretty soon you're 5 steps away from that. And
that's right.
But because you're so locked in it that this is absolutely the right viewpoint, you're just led down that way. It's like a rabbit hole, but these walls are just like a 10 feet tall. So you're just naturally led to this conclusion, which you think is absolutely the conclusion based on these conclusions.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly, you're pointing exactly to what the brain science shows, right? Is that when something happens, there's a potential miscommunication, or we perceive a slight on behalf, from the other person, we feel threatened, right? We feel a threat to our identity, maybe to our careers, maybe to our ego. And then our brain immediately goes into protective mode. And what it does is it makes these snap judgments. This, again, in social psychology, we call this premature cognition, right? So we make a judgment that's meant to protect us, right? So Richard is a jerk, right? Like that might be the thought, right? As I'm having it, and there's not validity to it. It's a protective mechanism. But you're right, is that once I believe that someone is a jerk, I then collect evidence to show that they're a jerk, right? And I just continue to push forward this narrative. And one of the most important questions you can ask yourself is to try to catch that premature cognition. So, ask yourself, wait, what's the story I'm telling myself here, right? And could I be wrong, right? And really, one of the things I really encourage people to do, and I try to do myself, is as soon as something starts happening, some tension is building, or I'm having a difficult conversation with someone, is try to take a step back and even go to a really trusted colleague and ask that question. Like, tell me how I might be seeing this wrong. And not the colleague who's going to be like, oh my gosh, no, you did it right. That person is a jerk. They're total passive aggressive, right? Don't go to that person. Go to the person who will say, well, you know what I think you're missing is the fact that Amy is under a ton of pressure right now. She's concerned about losing her job. And so that short temper, it's not about you. It's about how she's feeling insecure in this moment. Right. And I know a lot of this requires that we be like, quote unquote, the adult in the room, or even requires a bit of empathy for the other person, which is a tall order when someone is mistreating you, perhaps even, dehumanizing you. But it's not empathy in a generous way. I mean, it is generous, but really it's a strategic move for you, because what you're trying to do is undo that storytelling in that confirmation bias, so that you can see the situation more clearly and then make a more informed choice about how to react and how to handle it. And the informed choice may be, this person does not deserve my empathy. They're mistreating me. I either need to report the behavior, I need to exit this relationship, I need to do something a little more severe. But you can't do that until you're sure you're seeing the situation as clearly as possible.
One of the things I think is interesting about this puzzle, or this thing that you're talking about, is that on one hand, it's so simple, and on the other hand, it's so complex. I mean, the concept of this idea of like, it's not about you, is so simple, and yet it's so super complex. You know what I'm saying?
Well, and that's the, I remember sitting, actually, I do talks and workshops based on both of my books. And I remember sitting in this event. It was a gathering of women who worked at this tech company. And there was a very senior woman in the audience who was a sponsor of the rest of the group. She wasn't there necessarily to learn, but she paid attention through the whole thing. And at the end, she came up to me and she said, it's, everything you said are things I've thought about, things I've learned, but I don't do them. And I said, right. And that's why I'm trying to give you the really practical tips. And yes, some of it is common sense, but just as we were just speaking about, our brains aren't working in our favor in these moments, right? We have to actually overcome our brain's natural response, which makes it, and, no one ever teaches us how to do these things. We sort of learn along the way, like from, starting in elementary school, about how to interact with other humans, and no one's giving us guidance. We just sort of feel our way through it. So it's messy. We often make mistakes. We can't trust our instincts. So the advice I'm giving is, I agree, it's not revolutionary, but what I'm hoping to do is give people the real practical language, actions they can take, steps they can take to put what we know maybe when we're in our right frame of mind into practice.
Well, whenever you're trying to fight evolutionary biology, it's always a tough hill to climb, right? I mean, evolution's got 5 million years on you. So, if that's been,
Right.
ingrained in our thing and it hasn't evolutionarily gone away, there's a reason for it to be there. So,
That's right.
you're fighting an uphill battle. What is the most interesting thing that you've learned? I mean, you've been studying this problem now for quite a while. You've written a book. You've probably talked to thousands of people. But what are some of the really interesting things that you've learned from this process?
Yeah, gosh, there are so many things. And I will say, when you list all the ways in which I interact with this content and share this content, one of the things that has been most, I would say, humbling is how difficult it is still for me to do some of this in my personal life, right?
Oh,
So,
interesting.
like, if you interviewed my husband or my teenage daughter about how good am I at handling conflict, they would have a lot of fun stories to tell you about ways I had done it really poorly. I mean, I'm thinking about this blow up my daughter and I had, but just 2 nights ago, right?
Right.
Did I follow my own advice? Absolutely not. And I think that's one of the things that has been eye-opening is just the challenges of doing this consistently. And
Yeah.
granted, I am obviously, there's many ways in which I take my own advice and use my own tools, but that the challenge of just doing it consistently, practicing it over and over, and doing it in different contexts. Like sometimes it's very easy for some people to do it in a work context
Yes.
and more difficult in a personal, or easy to do in their nuclear family, but harder to do with their extended family,
Mm.
right? And just recognizing that. So that's one thing that I've learned, that I continue to learn, I should say. The other thing that I've really come to in handling or really researching, talking about this topic, is that I think you really said this right at the start, is that this takes up so much mind space.
Mm.
And, one of the things I did want to address with my most recent book is the sleepless nights that so many of us have.
Mm.
But I think one of the things we lose sight of, and this is really backed up by research, is that most of us have neutral or positive relationships at work. That's the majority of them.
Mm.
Now, there are always going to be someone or a couple people who push our buttons, who we really don't get along with. And unfortunately, those people take up a larger
Mm.
space in our mind because of our natural negativity bias, right? We're really, I can tell you, I can remember a performance review when I worked at that consulting firm, which, gosh, now is almost 20 years ago. I can tell you verbatim the lines that were negative. I cannot recall at all any of the positive things, right? And that's the same with interpersonal interaction. If this podcast didn't go well, at the end of the day, I would, my husband or my daughter asking me how my day went, I would be like, horrible. Oh my gosh, I completely bombed this podcast, or we had tech trouble, right? I would be so focused on, even though this would just be a half an hour of my day or an hour of my day, and everything else went fine. And so I think one of the things that I continue to learn, and we see over and over in the research, is the value of our positive relationships, and yet how much we don't appreciate them. And so a lot of times when people say, like, they'll describe to me that doing this job it's interesting in social situations, because when people hear the title of my book or hear what I do, they're like, oh, I have to tell you about my coworker, right? And I hear some really juicy stories. And when I, give them suggestions and they say, oh, I tried that. One of my final suggestions always is focus on your friends, because I'm guessing you have friends at work, right? And focus on those relationships. That's going to help you be more resilient. That's going to help you, right size those negative interactions you have, and hopefully have more sleep at night.
Well, the disproportionality problem you talk about is completely real. I mean, it's exactly what you said. You spend 90% of your time thinking about the 10% bad things or whatever, the bad relationships, and you ignore the 90% of, as you said, good relationships. Or if you get a review, you spend 90% thinking about the 10% of it that was negative, and not in 10% of the time on the 90% that was positive or whatever.
That's right.
So
That's right. Yeah. And it's, again, it's a natural inclination. It's a negativity bias. It's an evolutionary tendency for us to protect ourselves, because we have to scan for threats. We have to scan for the negative things. The problem is our brain's not good at discerning the real threats that we might experience versus the ones that are sort of, more of a light threat, like not getting my way on a project plan in that meeting all of a sudden feels so important when I'm battling with my colleague, but in the scheme of things is really not important. I mean, and that's another, just a practical tip that I do use over and over is to think about when I'm in that moment of a negative interaction, or when I'm up at night at 3 a.m. going over, oh gosh, why did I say that? How did they react? Is tell myself, okay, how much will I care about this in a week? How much will I care about this in a year? Will I remember this in 5 years? And that sort of tries to put it into perspective of, right, you know what? Like, it does feel urgent because my brain is focused on the negative, trying to protect me, but ultimately this is very inconsequential in the scheme of things. So let me take the emotion out of it and try to make a rational decision about how to proceed.
Now, I don't want to get sidetracked on this topic, but let me just ask you, does your work at all, have you touched into meditation at all? Because, part of meditation is to get out of your thoughts, not to let your thoughts run. So we don't have to get sidetracked on that, but I'm just curious to what extent your work kind of comes and touches meditation a little bit, or mindfulness, I guess I should say.
Yeah. And I would say, I read a lot about mindfulness. I work with in my role as a contributing editor at Harvard Business Review, I work with a lot of authors who write about mindfulness, and it's very much connected. There's, in my most recent book, I talk about how to get over the evolutionary process of our brain protecting us. And it is about mindfulness. It's about observing your thoughts. It's about breathing. It's about, and that's, I think, one of the things we have to remember, and this has gotten more true over the last few years, is that when we are cognitively overloaded, which many of us, I would say most of us are these days, right? We're not reaching for the best tools. We're not our best selves. And mindfulness sort of helps us restore our connection to the present, ideally restore our connection to who our values and who we want to be. So certainly there's a strong connection between what I advocate in terms of how to react or consider your reaction to these interactions, and meditation or mindfulness.
Helps with it. Yeah. One of the things I learned from mindfulness, and this relates completely to what you're saying, is that, if we articulated all the thoughts that we have, we'd probably sound like a crazy person. I mean, we'd literally be just saying the same thing over and over and over again, because these same thoughts, we would sound like a crazy person. And when you kind of think about that, it's like, oh my gosh, that's true,
Yes.
So, but
and they're just
doing it.
Yeah. And that's the thing. One of the things I think that because we get hooked on these thoughts about this other person, right? It part of the mind. And actually, I remember this was years ago. A colleague was doing a podcast about pausing, like taking a pause before you react, or taking a pause. She defined it in a very broad term, but she and I actually came up with this meditation, a pause meditation, when you're in the midst of a difficult conversation with someone or an interaction with someone, which is partly to just sort of pause and focus on your own body, your own reaction. Where are you feeling that reaction, but also to put yourself in their shoes for a moment. So to use that moment of meditation to think about how are they suffering? What's their situation? What's going on for them? And not that will resolve things, but it will put you in a far different frame of mind for when you go back to that interaction and have, try to start sorting things out.
All easier said than done.
Of course. Yeah.
What is sort of the most common reaction? You obviously teach this class. You talk to a lot of people. You've spoken to. What is the most common reaction? Wow, I never thought about this. Or I'm just curious. What is the most common reaction that you get when you first articulate these concepts?
There's a couple reactions, and one is, I've thought about this before, but I actually haven't had the tools to put it into practice. So I think a lot of people are really feel very relieved, either when they're listening to a workshop or a talk I give, or reading the book, right? Of like, oh, there's actually like frameworks for doing some of this. And I think they feel relieved of like, I know I need to do some of this. Like you've said a few times, easier said than done, right? I know I need to do some of this, but by giving them the tools, I think that really helps. One of the most interesting reactions I've been having to the new book, which, in the new book, I talk about different archetypes of difficult people and really their patterns of behavior. I've mentioned a few: pessimism, passive aggression. Like there's someone you would call the political operator, right? Someone who's really focused on their career. But I did not expect this reaction at all, but both in my talks about the book as well as online when I'm in social media, when I share about the book, some people will say, "Oh, you're making me realize I'm one of those people." And I have to say, I really underestimated readers and did not think they would identify with the archetypes. I thought they would say, "Oh, that's my boss, that's my colleague down the hall," right? That just start finger pointing, which that's the goal of the book, is to help them identify the behavior they're dealing with and then address it. But I really am surprised by how many people are recognizing their own behavior in the archetypes and are inspired to change as a result. My friend joked when the day the book came out, we were on a group text, and people were saying really nice things, congratulations about the book. And she said, "I have to tell you, I got my book this morning. I'm already 2 chapters in, and I'm going to gift it to my entire team so they know how to deal with me." and I was like, A+ for self-awareness, right? And I do love that. I love that it's a reaction I didn't expect, but it's one that's making me really happy that people are taking a look at their behavior.
Well, the thing I like about the universality of this problem you're tackling is how it transcends, every experience level, right? Whether you're the senior CEO or the boardroom at a gigantic company, or an entry level worker, this problem exists at every single level of corporations, right? It has nothing to do with, you can talk to middle managers, senior managers, junior employees, right? This problem applies at every level.
That's right. And I was talking to a group of CEOs yesterday and listening to them talk about their challenges with co-founders, with board members, with investors, right? It is the same patterns of behavior, whether you're in your first job just out of college or whether you're 30 years into your career and at the most senior level. And it's, I joke that I'll have work to do for the rest of my career because these problems aren't going away. I do notice though that those folks who are in more senior positions do have an easier time, adopting the right mindset, addressing some of the behavior. I think just because they have the experience and the confidence, that helps them do that. But it doesn't mean that those problems don't happen. It just means that we address them differently. There's this concept of interpersonal resilience, and that's really what I'm trying to encourage in all of my work, which is the ability to feel less stress when you are deep in a difficult interaction and have more confidence when you have to have that challenging conversation. And I just think many folks who do have more experience, deeper into their careers, tend to have more interpersonal resilience than those of us who are just starting out.
What is your experience working with teens or college-age students or even younger children with this problem? Because this kind of starts in 5th grade or whatever, right? It's not reserved to adults in any way.
No, and I don't have a ton. I've done a couple sort of guest talks for high school classes. I have a friend who teaches a class. She works at an international school in Helsinki, and I've spoken to her class. And it is, and actually, now that I think about it, I've also done talks at some boarding schools for their students as well. And it is the same questions, just sort of different context, right? And when I'm talking to the CEOs, they're talking about a co-founder. When I'm talking to a boarding school student, it's about their roommate, but it's the same concerns. I think there's great potential to do more with even younger kids, because like I said earlier, no one teaches us how to do this.
Totally.
I don't know, I'm sure the same is true for you. No one sat me down and said, here's how you have a good fight, right? Here's how you handle an argument with a friend or with a colleague. People just don't share that sort of advice. And again, if we look out into broader society, or what we see on social media, like, it's not a good model. It's divisive. It's we encourage people to be strongly opinionated. We need different models, and I think getting kids earlier on in their life thinking about these things, thinking about what's my role in making sure I have a positive team interaction or a positive relationship with the people who I spend the most time with, I just think will be incredibly valuable.
So where do you go from here, Amy? You've written this fantastic book. You're, speaking and you're teaching and lecturing. Like, do you, is there more research to do? I mean, where do you go from here?
Yeah, I mean, there's always more to say on this topic. I have to, the manuscript that I handed in for this book was about twice as long as the end book. So I have lots on the cutting room floor that I want to work with, including there was a lot of advice in the original draft for those people who did identify with some of the archetypes, who thought, oh, I am the insecure manager, or I am the passive aggressive peer. I want to do a lot of that. And there's just more to explore. I think as things happen in organizations, when we think about layoffs, the recession coming, divisive society, that's going to change the dynamics of these relationships. And while some of the fundamental principles will stay the same, I think we have to continually revise the tactics for the context in which we all work. So that's where I'm focused, is, how can I continue to listen to what's causing people strife and upset in their work environment, and how can I give them the advice they need in order to appropriately tackle those situations.
Are most of the problems that you encounter from just interpersonal reactions, or do you find that, what about stuff that happens over social media and emails and texts? I mean, aren't those the same? Can't they cause the same things to keep you up at night? Or what are your experience with that?
Oh my God, it's one of the things I often say, especially in my workshops around conflict, is like, if you you probably could not find a worse medium in which to have a difficult conversation than text-based medium, whether that's typing a comment somewhere on LinkedIn or sending a Slack message to a colleague or an email, because there's no sort of emotional language that goes around it, right? We don't have any of the nonverbal cues. We're not encouraged to think of the other person empathetically, because we're just quickly typing out a retort. And so, I do think that these are, I think about things that happen in meetings. I think about things that happen, in the hallways at offices, but all of this is, in fact, more often happening on Zoom or in Slack or over email. And again, those aren't ideal mediums for these difficult conversations. So we have to develop tactics that help us compensate. One of my favorites is, because email, you can use a ton of emojis. You're never going to convey the same intention or empathy you would convey with the tone of your voice or your facial expressions. So I often try to lay out what's my intention with that email before I send it, especially if I think it might cause some trickiness, is just say, my intention with this email is to update the team and lay out 3 things that I think we need to address next time we meet, right? So rather than someone reading into, well, what is she trying to do with this email? Is she trying to prove that she knows everything? Is she trying to, steal territory? Just being really clear about what your intention is up front in some of those mediums can help sort of short circuit some of the tensions that might arise.
Well, Amy, it's just been wonderful talking to you. Obviously, we could talk about this for hours, but it's totally clear to me that there's absolutely no shortage for the demand for your services and advice.
Well, that's both good news and bad news, right? Good news for my career, but I hate to think about how many of us are really suffering with these issues. And I really hope that my work gives some people peace of mind and better relationships. That's ultimately, I think, what we all want.
Totally. This is Richard Hsu and Amy Gallo. Thanks.